Skynet's metal-headed murderer will be back from the future in Tim Miller's Terminator Dark Fate this week, which sees Linda Hamilton and Arnold Schwarzenegger reprising their respective roles that defined their careers as Sarah Connor and the Terminator. But a lot has happened since Judgment Day, and not a lot of it good. This will be the fourth attempt, excluding a TV show, at returning to a franchise that has failed reaching its glory days. But why? Between a threequel of bad jokes, a prequel sequel, and a Batman going crazy, and a reboot that got lost in its own timeline, no Terminator chapter after the second installment captured the same lightning Cameron had so masterfully bottled. But what were the crucial ingredients that made the Terminator and reverted Terminator 2 Judgment Day the perfect machine, and what is it the Dark Fate needs to do to get it all back? I'm Tom from Screen On Point, and we're asking how the Terminator went haywire. To imagine James Cameron's iconic assassin from the future is to see him clad in leather, cool black shades, and promising he'll be back in an Austrian accent that's as thick as his own damn neck. Schwarzenegger is and will always be the Terminator, but what's interesting about the identity that he's so synonymous with is just which one specifically he's remembered for, and more importantly, the genre his most beloved installments are assigned to, that their sequels have eventually distanced themselves from. Like the Chrome character himself, James Cameron's now career-defining films were bolted together using elements from various genres to construct the final product. Sci-fi segments of time travel and fears of technological determinism went hand in motorized hand with high-octane action sequences, putting Arnie in the arena he'd rule for years to come. Pull back those components though, and one that's faded from the Terminator's arsenal is the underlying layer of horror that ran prominently in the original film and carefully through to Judgment Day. Originally, the Terminator was the stuff of nightmares, Cameron's to be precise. Those that don't know their Skynets from their Cyberdynes may be unaware that it crawled its way to life by the way of Jim's subconscious. After being given the boot on his first directing job for Piranha 2 this morning, the young filmmaker was in Rome fighting both the studio that had ejected him and a fever at the same time. Low on cash and high on a temperature, he awoke one day caked in sweat with vivid images of a metal skeleton breathed in flame, clawing along the floor wielding a knife. So alarmed by this murderous metal monster, Cameron began sketching him out and constructing the origin of where it came from. His vision expanded into a barren landscape broken by a war in the future and a battle between man and machine due to its $6.4 million budget would take place here in the present day, aka 1984. What he would finish was a story he described as a tech noir thriller, but one with various horror elements wired into its core. So with that, the Terminator itself could be compared to Frankenstein's monster, literally brought to life in a flurry of lightning before getting the lay of the land. In fact, it's actually the same coil machinery behind the visual effect that was used in James Whale's 1931 adaptation of Mary Shelley's classic tale. Gradually though, Schwarzenegger's soulless cyborg shares all the traits of a familiar filmic threat. Before he's dehumanized on a physical level, shortly after his arrival he actually establishes himself as a mechanized Michael Myers. Against the shape, Schwarzenegger's slow pace and cement set features are as terrifying as the man in the mask and overalls. The cold dehumanization of what is and his reason for being there amplified by cinematographer Adam Greenberg using a steel-like hue that fills our glimpses into the wearing days of future past and the present LA nights. Greenberg labelled this as James Cameron's Blue, which would reappear in the likes of Aliens, The Abyss and Terminator 2. We also get a killer's point of view, albeit from a far more advanced perspective. Cameron upgrades Halloween's mouth-breathing poster boy for the whirl of a computer and what the crew aptly dubbed Termovision. This insight makes it clear we aren't dealing with the usual inherently evil antagonist with a baseless goal, but a machine far more calculated, like the Sudoku-like segment of the screen reveals. It has the same effect as when applied in horror by disorientating us and seeing just how close the danger is to the victim we're rooting for. Seeing through this crimson coloured window cemented that this villain, unlike others Cameron was competing with, was literally built with the purpose to kill. Just as interestingly though, like Michael, the T-800 had a seasoned adversary who understood their enemy, Kyle Reese. The soldier from the future acts like an on-edge Dr. Loomis to Hamilton's Laurie Strode, obviously minus the fornicating, warning us of the looming threat that lies ahead. Adding his voice of logic and his understanding of the nightmare Sarah was in added a sharp edge of reality with fantastic elements, putting the Terminator above the greats, including the ones Cameron himself had learned from. Back then, Halloween's John Carpenter had a huge influence on the then director in the making that would become a master of building blockbusters. Prior to planning Sarah Connor's termination, Cameron had been painting derelict skylines and neo-etched flight plans for Snake Plissken in Carpenter's Escape from New York. Hoping for the same success, Cameron was keen for a comeback from Piranha 2 and saw that Carpenter's own reverted story of the night he came home as what he perceived to be a triumph of low-budget filmmaking. Suddenly, Cameron's nightmare-wielding knives as his weapon of choice made a little bit more sense. As Cameron puts it, he created a slasher movie slammed into sci-fi cyberpunk veneer, which is not too easy to say. Cut together like a slasher, Sarah sprints and sneaks through the neon glow of LA, ducking down during car chases and police station massacres to keep out of danger that may be approaching. The exemplary moment of Cameron really having a go at Carpenter's work though is the Terminator's break-in at Sarah's apartment. It's just got it all. Scantily clad victims to be, fake scares courtesy of Pugsley the pet iguana, and a character clueless to the danger she's in until it bursts out in front of her. Swap bullets for a blade and you've got a scene that could be used in any of Michael's murderous misadventures. But this section of scare building wasn't the only one Cameron was having a stab at. Because the shell of Schwarzenegger slowly peeled away, the futuristic horror soon became a creature feature. The first major hit Arnie takes sets him up as looking more and more like a machine manufactured by George A. Romero, and tapping into that body horror by showing shots of Schwarzenegger nonchalantly performing surgery on himself. Cameron provided a menace welded to metal and motors. It was the same hair-raising fear that was being fueled by the likes of Romero's zombie films and even John Carpenter's The Thing. These classics and Cameron's harnessed a horror in humanity by getting under our skin and perverting it, showing us a threat that looks familiar, albeit for a grotesque element underneath. In the case of the Terminator, this gradual decomposition of Skynet's soldier led to the full reveal of an image that echoed the scare-inducing work from even Ray Harryhausen, as Reese took swings at a figure that was a massively advanced version of the skeleton soldiers Jason and his Argonauts scrapped with. Even the same techniques of bringing him to life were applied, with stop-motion sequences courtesy of special effects legend Stan Winston being intercut with more killer POVs and medium shots of the T-800 lurching towards our heroine and her guardian. Of course, until she terminated that motherfucker. This amalgamation of horror that Cameron had so effectively included in his story of future Predator and present-day Prey established not just his career as a top-tier filmmaker, but the perfect formula to be carefully redistributed in what many deem not just one of the best sequels ever made, but one of the greatest films of all time. 7 years on from the Terminator, Cameron had found a balance between action and the futuristic horror he discovered and explored it further, polishing his scare tactics with Aliens and pushing the limits of special effects with The Abyss. He applied both in creating the perfect blockbuster machine that was Judgment Day. To understand his thought process and the methods used, it's probably worth noting that Cameron once explained his rule of making a sequel being to surprise and reinvent, which explains some of the film's greatest tricks used in T2 that made it all the more terrifying than before. Seeing Arnie hit, hammered and torn down to his cold steel chassis wasn't going to scare audiences anymore because they'd already seen it happen, and most importantly, they knew his limitations. This explains why Cameron not only set Schwarzenegger on our side this time, but why we had a more terrifying foe to pit him against. Robert Patrick's T-1000 was everything Arnie wasn't. Instead of the hulking horror storming his way through anyone and anything to get to the girl, Patrick was the Silver Spectre in a badge, a terror that moved with a fluidity and grace that provided a ghostly presence. Where the old model would burst through a barrier, this one would simply walk through it, or most likely be there already. The threat of a danger looming from something that looked human was turned up to 1,000 with Patrick's new model. Expanding on the horror hiding in plain sight, there was a stronger element of paranoia faced in among this new breed of slasher that actually carried knives this time around and switched the stalker pace for an all-out sprint. In addition to this, with the use of computer special effects and Stan Winston's stunning craftsmanship at creating replica ripped apart antagonists, it fortified the same visceral and equally unnatural horror elements that audiences feared but were fascinated by in the original. Of course, it wasn't just the fans of the Terminator flocking to see the second round. Schwarzenegger had millions of fans that had found their new hero in Cameron's original villain and would be lining up to see him in action. In between the first two films, his career had shot into the stratosphere, knocking out hits like Commando, Predator and Total Recall, so seeing him back for good as the hero in Judgment Day was a definite moneymaker.
Terminator 2, Judgment Day. This time he's back. For good.
Trust me.
It was also partly to blame for the issues with the films that followed. Arnie was now an action star that had films built around him, and Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines was a testament to that. The threequel, directed by Jonathan Mostow, was tonally a far cry from the perfectly designed movie machine that preceded it. Schwarzenegger was no longer the intense and nearly immortal enemy turned protector we'd come to love. He was now the straight man in an all-out action flick that was heavy on jokes,
Drop your weapon! And the coffin!
which while had been present in T2 now made him the punchline. All talk to the hand and star-shaped sunglasses, and not even a single "I'll be back." As far as following Cameron's rule of reinventing, writers John Brancato and Michael Ferris had the T-800 fighting a female Terminator, the T-X, and was a basic foil to the heroes rather than a terrifying threat that the T-1000 had become. And the arsenal welded into the Terminator's former foe was used to frightening effect, but here it was as a gimmick. Elements like this pushed the threequel closer towards the massive spectacle Cameron had in T2 and away from the horror that was absent this time around. Besides the scene of the T-X being a backseat driver, the majority of key deaths were completely off camera, resulting to blood splatters and the act being in view, not the outcome. As a result, it removed the dark and unsettling element of the lives at risk simply because you couldn't see it when they ended. In fact, the film's bleakest move was to let Judgment Day actually happen, but this was less of a plot point and more of a business plan, ensuring sequels could get queued up as well. 6 years later, and the changed trajectory had gone so far as to barely include the face of the franchise. Too busy governing California, Arnold was absent from the PG-13 Terminator Salvation, albeit a digital cameo. Instead, Christian Bale, who is now a bankable star after the success of the $3.5 billion Dark Knight trilogy, had laid down the cape and picked up the rifle as John Connor alongside Sam Worthington in a chapter sold as an all-out war movie. Appointed to the battlefield was Charlie's Angels director McGee, yep, that's still the name he goes by, who was attempting to give his own take on the world fans were so fond of, and the response wasn't a particularly warm one. Aesthetically, its sun-scorched nuclear landscape resembled Mad Max with Transformers. Now, whilst Mad Max 2 was an influence on Cameron's post-nuclear landscape as far back as the first movie, his nightmarish world of tomorrow still kept its distance from George Miller's classic. This one seemed to drive straight through it. Also, once again, the film softened up with the PG-13, the rating that Salvation had been stamped with, inviting a wider audience, keeping the body horror and the graphic human casualty at a minimum. Any opportunity of gore like Arnie's surgery was saturated, and instead of going into the circuits and sinew, a key scene that revealed Sam Worthington's human cyborg hybrid kept the audience at a distance, avoid getting to the gore that they were familiar with that the film had intentionally refrained from. As for the threat of the titular terrors themselves, here Terminators were just faceless drones that Bale's Connor took out with ease, even beating his mum's recorded time of killing 2 in the first act. Ultimately, the only thing that got attention was when Christian Bale unleashed on a crew member, and that was used in a Family Guy skit. Of course it was.
I tell you, he's treated me worse than that jerk Christian Bale did.
I want you off the fucking set, you prick!
Sorry.
No, don't just be sorry.
And with the lack of success leading to a planned trilogy of films, the damn thing only went and got its plug pulled. Which then leads us to the last and possibly worst entry to the franchise so far, tagged not as Terminator 5 but as a new Terminator 1 that plucked key plot points from the original hit. Terminator Genisys ignored Rise of the Machines and Salvation, hoping that checking fans' boxes by reproducing and tweaking iconic scenes from the original films would be enough. It was a desperate attempt to revitalise and reboot the franchise that it was connected to, ultimately not making a lick of sense. Scares as well as a cohesive storyline have been put at the bottom of the list in place of action-packed set pieces that, due to being laced with CGI, were void of peril or danger. This leaves us now caught up on the Terminator's tumultuous timeline, with all hope resting on dark fate to rekindle what made the original films of the franchise so compelling. As the mistakes of the past make incredibly clear, it wasn't the action of rock'em sock'em robots going at each other, but Schwarzenegger, and to his credit Robert Patrick's unstoppable shadow of death, that drew from Frankenstein and Michael Myers for inspiration to carry out its mission. Horror has been in the system of the Terminator since the beginning. Like its antagonist, it may have looked like something else, but the monster was always hiding just underneath the surface. Maybe it's about time it was reinstalled. Thanks so much to Nick, not the bees Staniforth, for writing this piece. You can follow him on Twitter at Nick Staniforth. Thanks for watching that video. Please do like and subscribe. We upload 2 tasty and tenderized videos a week to sink your teeth into, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to follow us at Screen On Point and Tom A. Ransom on Twitter to satisfy my narcissistic need for acceptance and love, and you make sure you have a wonderful day.